When you talk, do people see you as a must-have or just another commodity? That answer is shaped by one thing, your narrative. And in today's crowded, noisy marketplace, if you're not telling the right story, then you're not getting the right results. And in this episode of the podcast Interview Marketing Show, I'm joined by John Rougeux, founder of Flag and Frontier, and a leader in the field of category design. He'll walk us through the 6 powerful strategies that you can use to define your space, evangelize your point of view, and position yourself as the category leader, not just another option in the mix. We'll explore how your narrative shapes perception, how to lead with bold, clear messaging, and why podcast interviews are one of the most effective ways to educate the market on the problem and to own your category. So again, are you being seen as a must-have or a commodity? Your story already told them. Let's make sure it's saying the right thing. One of the things you hear me talk about is having a strong narrative. You've got to understand who you are before you start sharing that with the world. And one of the people that I reference often was the old host of Category Thinkers, a great mind in the category design space, and the founder of Flag and Frontier. John, welcome so much.
Hey, Tom. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah. So let's talk about this. And I think the big idea, this big problem is you can either be unique or a commodity, right? It's one of the two. And the story you tell is how you present that to the world. And you really helped me understand this. Can you unpack that a little bit? What you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So, I like to approach things from first principles, right? And so if we think about, let's go back to what a business is trying to do in the first place. And this may not be true for every business, but the clients that I work with, they're trying to do 3 things. They're trying to build a dominant company. They're trying to be profitable, and they're trying to create a space that's defensible for them. You might call that a new territory. You might even call that a new category or ownership of a category. For any business that's going to go about pursuing such a strategy, as we were talking about before this interview started, doing that with a commodity isn't really possible, right? And that can mean we can refer to the product, we can refer to maybe how it's distributed, we can refer to the brand. There's all sorts of different ways and a company and the brand and its offering might be commoditized. So if your goal is to achieve those 3 things that I talked about, it's a given that you're going to have to be different in one way or another, right? It's just a truism. I don't really see how there's any other way around that. If you buy into that thinking, then the question becomes, okay, what do we do that's different? And then just as importantly, how do we articulate that to the people that matter in a way that's relevant and meaningful to them? And that's where the role of a narrative comes in.
I had forgotten, you're a philosophy major, aren't you? Your undergrad?
Well, it's putting it a little generously. I have a minor in philosophy, but if I took a philosophy quiz right now, I'd probably disappoint you sorely with my results. I can't remember the difference between Kant and Descartes and all the others, but yeah.
Well, all I know is when you said going back to first principles, that just struck me. It's like, yeah, too often it's like, what are we optimizing for? And people are like, more leads, more this, more that. That's not the basis of the business there. It's the profits, the standing out, making it defensible, all of those things. So where do you see this starting, right? How do you make sure that the market sees you as different? I mean, that narrative, how do you, as the founder, as the spokesperson, how do you create that narrative?
That's a really good question because, look, I love the book Play Bigger. It's transformed my career, but it doesn't necessarily help you go through that process of developing the right point of view and the right narrative. And I don't think that's the intention of the book, and no book can cover every single base. It's a great mental model for thinking about the work. So what I've thought about, the way that I approach this, I started to look at all sorts of different businesses that have succeeded in different contexts. Some of them created brand new categories from scratch. But there's lots of businesses that took different paths to get there. And what I wanted to explore was, is there truly this this two-path approach where either you create a new category from scratch, as many people think, or are you just a commodity? Is it truly that black and white, or are there other paths to get to that dominant position I talked about? And what I discovered was there's really what I call 6 category strategies to building that dominant, profitable, defensible business. And we can break those down if you want.
Yeah, please. Let's dig into those.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's start with the most obvious one: creating a new category from scratch. Let's pick Salesforce is the example they use in Play Bigger. We can riff on that one if you want, but you can pick a more obvious one like Netflix, right? Everyone uses Netflix. They created 2 categories. First was the idea of mail order or DVD delivery by mail, and the second was streaming. I'm tempted to dive into that strategy and unpack it, but I just want to gloss over the 6 first so we can kind of get a lay of the land. And if it makes sense to dive deeper, we can. So that's one strategy. The second is to win a category that's maybe already established, but the race is still playing out. So you see this with Gen AI today. I'm not totally clear who actually created the category. Maybe it was OpenAI, but you have Claude or Anthropic and Gemini and Microsoft's products all competing for this very hotly contested category of who's going to win the Gen AI space. The reason these strategies matter is where you are, what strategy you're pursuing at a different point in time determines the narrative, determines the story that you want to tell to the market. So as I go through the remainder of these, I'll try to speak to how the story might shift a little bit. So when you're creating a new category, job number 1 is to show the market why a new problem has emerged, or why there's a new way of solving a problem that people hadn't realized in the first place. This is classic material from Play Bigger. It's less about your solution, your product, your service in particular, and more about changing the way people think about the world. That's the job number 1. You don't do that, nothing else matters. Now, when we get into that second category strategy, winning an emerging category, the story changes a little bit. Now, you're still educating the market on why this category matters, and maybe you're selling the problem and or revealing a new way of doing things, but you then have to start leveling up some of what you do to speak to why you're different from other solutions. And really what you're trying to do is make the case that your company deserves to win this category, to be seen as the dominant design in this space. So there's one strategy will emerge to the next, but the story you're telling and the things that you emphasize first start to change as your category evolves. So we can get into the next 4, but I'll just pause there to see if there's anything you want to double click on first.
Yeah. And I think especially taking it through the lens of the podcast guest that's going out there, right? If you don't differentiate yourself to the market, no one else will. And one of the things that you said there is evangelizing the problem, right? This is how you see the problem in the world. Once you have that lens, that narrative, now people never see it the same way again. I think I mentioned before the other day, I talked with somebody that was a full service digital agency of 4 people. And I'm like, a digital marketing agency, that seems redundant today. And how can anybody be full service? I'm like, well, what makes you different? And it was like, well, we've got better customer service. Well, that's not different. You just in your narrative there told me that you were a commodity. So that's how I'm going to judge you. And the first couple of ways that you said there, right, to establish the category, right? No, that's different. Or trying to take that market position on there of talking about the problem, but how you solve it differently. But on both of those, it's focusing on the customer's problem, not we're better, we're nicer. So let's jump into the other 4.
Okay. So if you think about a category evolving over time, there's some work that my friends Mike Damphouse and Kevin mainly exposed me to through a British economist named Paul Garaski, and he studied how categories evolve. Most categories evolve to a point where one company, and sometimes it's a few, emerge as the dominant players in that space. And then you have a handful of players that compete for a very small portion of that market. And so if you've done your job successfully, and maybe it's creating a new category, maybe it's winning that emerging category, the natural evolution of that is that category matures. There's existing demand and understanding for that category, and you're the leader. Like, congratulations, like you're in first place. You're the Salesforce equivalent of your category. But your job can't stop there. You have to continue to evolve that category forward and maintain your category leadership. It doesn't mean that you're not thinking about other category strategies or exploring new territories, but you have to defend that space. And so we'll go back to Salesforce. You see Salesforce continuing to invest in R&D and leveling up its CRM product, and now it's got a platform of products across multiple categories. But it's not taking its foot off the gas. But again, going back to your original question, how do you know if you have the right narrative? Well, if you're Salesforce and you're leading that space, you're not trying to really evangelize the category itself at that point. People know what a CRM is. But your story has to be about where you're taking that category forward.
So you're evangelizing the vision of what the future is going to look like because you're the leader and you're going to make that.
And I have one client I'm working with now. It's in the nonprofit space, actually. They arguably lead their category, but a lot of the things that made them special and defined them as really the standard of this space within the nonprofit world have kind of become lost, and they've become diluted as the organization has grown and gone global, and people have transitioned in and out. And so a lot of what we're doing isn't as much around like reinventing the product, but it's just like rediscovering and trying to surface what makes this brand the leader in the first place, and making sure that they're bold and clear enough in what they're saying to where the market recognizes that, because they've let themselves become commoditized, but they have a lot of things that make them special that are just hiding beneath the surface.
You use the word bold and clear. And that's interesting because I think too many people I hear on podcast interviews, it's like this discussion, and there's nothing that's bold or clear about it. It's just like warm water, right? And there's no disruptive statement or no strong point of view that people can say, I agree with this or I don't agree with this. And that's not leadership. That's just sort of falling in and being unmemorable.
Well, that's such an interesting point, because this particular organization, if you talk to people individually, they would be really excited about some of the things that they stood for. And then you'd say, okay, well, why don't you talk about that? And it's like, well, we don't know if we have like how the board's going to feel about that. We don't think, we don't know if our leadership team is ready to like be that bold and clear with our message. Like it's going to turn people away. And they were right. Like it was, some of the things they stood for were polarizing. And the process we went through allowed us to get the leadership team, the CEO, the whole group that needed to give the green light to share this bold message. We got them in the room and we said, hey, this is what we think we should say. Let's talk about that. And at the end of that process, they're like, yes, we should say this. Let's do it. And the marketing team, you could just feel like the sense of relief and the sense of excitement that came from saying, oh, okay, finally, we can say the things that we want to be able to say because we got the buy-in from the people in the organization that we needed to move forward with this. And it's very powerful when that shift happens.
I was going to say that's a magic skill there, to take all those people and to get them to come to that. My sense is that it's easier for a small company, the founder, to be bold and be clear on that than it is with a bigger company or more decision makers, right? When you're bold, you may stand out, but you also may get fired.
Right, that's true. I think you're right, but I want to add to that a little bit. In my experience working with smaller companies and younger companies, and founders in particular, yes, the founder can be more tapped into that point of view and that bold way of thinking and talking about the brand and about the problem and how they see the world. But a lot of times founders are very good if you get them personally on camera or on the keyboard. but that vision doesn't always translate in a way that their team can use it effectively. They're thinking about the business 24/7 and it just kind of like flows from them. But then you get someone who's hired in, nothing against them, but they're hired in, they're learning about the company, and it just doesn't like, there's not a good framework for them to take that raw energy and that really exciting point of view and capture it and accelerate and amplify it. So they have a different problem. It's less about like, do we know what the point of view is? And it's more about like, it's just this raw energy kind of floating out in space, but we haven't like bottled it in a way that we can actually like use it as rocket fuel for the rest of the company.
That's interesting, because I went through my mind of the different companies I've worked for. And when you were in person and everybody was around there, we called it tribal knowledge, right? Of the energy of the leader, the vision of the leader. It was very clear. And then as you got more remote, right, either multiple locations, it was hard to keep that going. And I can only think of now, digitally, it gets diluted down each time. So it's got to be really clear and very intentional on there too.
And I don't want to make like too broad a statement about founders, but not all of them are like great at like internal communication and getting the team updated on their latest thinking. Like they'll have a conversation with one person on the team, but then there's 80 others that haven't been exposed to that, and by the time they hear it, it's like 2 months later, and the CEO's thinking has evolved, and they can never really keep up with like the rate of change in their thinking.
I have to laugh. I think this is partly therapy here too. As you're talking about founders, I've heard some clients that say they have all their team members listen to their podcast and their podcast interviews, because it's sort of like, okay, now you can hear the conversations that I'm having, the things that I'm talking about, what our clients are asking about too. So what other of the 6 categories there?
Yeah, so we've got 3 more, right? So let's cover the rest of our territory. So the third is niching down. And that sounds like thinking small, like we're just going to pick this category and we're going to carve out our little segment of it. That can be true, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. I talk about, one of my favorite examples is Viva Systems, which started in the late 2000s, several years after Salesforce really came into its own. And they developed CRM for life sciences companies. And that was so the thing with niching down is if you can find a segment that has some unique needs or considerations that aren't really well addressed by the category leader, if there is one, then that's a territory you can own, because you can go after that problem in a way that's intentional and more effective than an all-purpose solution could. So that's what they did. They found life sciences companies have some very specific needs around how a CRM works, and they doubled down on that. Now they went on to expand to other products for life sciences, but they're a multi-billion-dollar company today. They're very successful. So they use that niche down strategy as a way to like get some leverage and then build off of that into a much larger business.
The riches are in the niches. I think of like David C. Baker always talks about the vertical niching down and the horizontal, right? So as opposed to just being, we're a digital marketing agency. Well, that's pretty much everything. But no, we're the digital marketing agencies for law firms, right? Or we're the ad team for law offices, right? And all we do is ads for law offices. That's a powerful niche right there. And that's a category that you can definitely own.
Oh yeah, absolutely. One of the others is to reinvent a stagnant category. So this is not really an obvious one, but so when I told you earlier, I was trying to look at companies that have been successful and then understand the path that they took to get there. One of them that I couldn't get off of my mind was Zoom. Okay, so video conferencing as a broad category had been around for a very long time prior to Zoom. And I don't know, did you ever use like WebEx or GoToMeeting or any of those tools yourself?
I've used all of those, and I'm old enough to remember using all of those and having to download them.
Right. Yeah. I had one, I worked with HP several years ago, and they used, I think it was WebEx. And I'm a pretty tech savvy guy, Tom. I could never get the video to work ever. And And I think that is like emblematic of how that category worked at that time. It was difficult to use. It was cumbersome. It required a lot of hardware capacity. It required a lot of internet bandwidth. You're like you said, you're always having to download something or install an update or this, that, or the other. And so Zoom didn't create video conferencing, but they reimagined how that space should work. And they came out to market with a solution that didn't require special hardware, didn't require a big registration sign-up process. You could use it for free. I don't think you even had to download the app. I could be mistaken on that. But it was just a totally different distribution strategy, a totally different value proposition. And that turned out to be, as we know now, what the market needed. And so they ended up kind of subverting the category and leading it, because there wasn't really a good solution that had dominated this space that people were happy with, especially as outside of the pure enterprise.
All of these are different ways. And I hope people, as they're listening to these, are like, these are ways that I could get market dominance here, right? You don't have to be the next Salesforce. You don't have to be the next Zoom, but there are problems out there that you can evangelize for. So what's the last of the 6?
Okay. The last of the 6, who do you use for a bank? If you don't mind me asking.
I have 2 banks. I have Chase, which should be a 4-letter word. And then I've got a local credit union, which, never try, doing big business banking through that. They don't know how to transfer funds overseas.
Okay. So I have Chase too. I can go on a tirade about a problem I had with trying to open an account, but that's for another time. I use USAA as well. So what are any bank right now, it's not really a bank, right? It's more of like a financial institution. They offer credit cards, banking, retirement products, investment products. There's a whole slew of things that they'll offer. Now that wasn't always the case, right? I mean, you go back far enough and it was really just a place where you would physically deposit cash. And then what they did over time was they took other products, other financial services, other categories, and they consolidated them into a platform or a category of categories, if you will. I use that example to start because everyone can kind of immediately get that. Now, the place that I see this play out most for myself, this is just because of the businesses I'm exposed to. You see this a ton in B2B SaaS companies, platform consolidation. So like Gong is a great example. Gong started off with some conversation intelligence tools, and that is one of the things that they offer now. But they really offer like a suite of solutions that helps revenue teams be more effective at sourcing and managing and closing revenue. And what's interesting, so here's a really cool thing about these 6 strategies. Sometimes they'll layer on top of each other. So Gong is pursuing this platform consolidation play, but Clary's doing the same thing. SalesLoft as well. And then there's a 4th one that's escaping my memory at the moment. But all of those are competing against an emerging category. This emerging category is like which revenue platform is going to be the leader, who's going to come out ahead as like the kind of the go-to solution for this. They're calling it revenue intelligence platforms, or Clary's got their own name for it, but it's both a consolidation play and an emerging category that are happening simultaneously.
It's just that narrative around it and how they see their place in the world and how they communicate that to the marketplace too. We've all gone through the elevator pitches or just meeting somebody, and it's like, well, what do you do? Right. And when it's something that's just generic, it's like, oh, okay. In our minds, we just put them in that commodity box. And if we hear something that's different, it's like, what's that? Tell me more about that. I've never heard of that before. That's unique. And we listen to that. And we all discriminate because we try to make life easy for ourselves, right? Try to put things in buckets. So if we put ourselves in the buckets by our messaging, it's going to be hard to ever stand out. That idea that I love how you're helping people with. It's not just, it's being unique and not just being written off as a commodity based on the narrative that you're sharing with the world.
That's right. Well, and the one thing that I would challenge people with is that everything we've talked about can't be just a messaging or a story exercise. So like, let's use that last example, consolidating into a platform. There's a lot of businesses and they'll acquire or build a lot of disparate features and they'll call it a quote unquote platform. But unless that solution adds more value than the sum of its parts, it's not really a platform. It's just like a one-stop shop. And I wouldn't really call that differentiating unless the fact that you can buy all those through a single vendor adds meaningful value to you as a buyer, which may or may not be the case. So what we have to think about is, this is the reason we do narrative work as a company strategy exercise, not a marketing exercise, because we're really not just there to help the marketing team be more effective in their messaging. That matters. It matters a lot. But what we're really making sure of is that the product and the engineering team or whoever's designing the solution is thinking about where to take their efforts. And are they aligned with this category strategy? And are they building something that can fulfill these promises that we're making and like bring this vision to life? I think people get this wrong with category design or narrative a lot, that it's just this kind of thing you tack on after the fact, but it's really like the most basic foundational layer that you could work on.
And I agree with you. And it's our mutual friend, Christopher Lockhead, was the one that, really challenged me on this very beginning. And when they were first launching the book, and this idea of, you've got to own it. You've got to communicate it, and you've got to educate the market on it. And it was slow. It was painful, but we kept saying it enough, evangelizing the problem and the solution. And then the market would start to pick that up. But there's always that next one. And part of that I feel sorry for marketers is there's this idea of that you talk about, that there's attribution and then there's influence. And this idea of that, everything can be attributed. And it's really easy to point to Facebook ads or Google, whatever it is, and to have a chart that shows that. But is it influencing the market? Can you unpack that a little bit? Because I think that's something that speaks to both the founder and the marketer.
I can try to speak to it. My background is in marketing. I was never an ace at attribution. I always found myself wanting to think more about what was happening in the minds of buyers rather than what some tracking system was telling me or what some report was trying to indicate. Okay, so if you look at the long span of marketing, there was a long period of time where attribution wasn't really. I don't want to say it wasn't possible, but it wasn't given the priority that it is now. Both from my experience, and then even though I'm not really a marketer now, I still work with a lot of marketers. I think they're put in a difficult situation where there's so many tools and so much technology available that the temptation is to work on things that can be tracked. Or maybe it's not even the temptation for the marketer. It's if the CEO or the board, they're asking the wrong questions maybe. And they're asking questions about, well, if we do this, how many more dollars of revenue are we going to get? How many more leads are we going to get? And if those questions are used to frame marketing's investments, they'll naturally gravitate towards things where attribution can be more easily measured. And I think this is an issue, especially if you're trying to build or win a category. If you ask yourself what really has to happen first before a category will evolve, or before my brand is seen differently or perceived as a leader, it's nothing that will ever show up in some sort of attribution report. It's going to happen up here in the minds of your buyers. There has to be a mindset shift. It'd be really interesting if we could come up with some ways to measure this. Maybe there are. Maybe someone who will find these out. But like there's investments you have to make in conditioning the market and getting people to think differently that are necessary. But I would be surprised if they would show up cleanly in some sort of attribution report. You can measure things like, okay, brand awareness or aided recall, unaided recall. Those are useful tools. But we really have to get people to think differently. And again, I'm not like a hardcore market researcher. You could probably go out and ask enough people of the right questions to see how they think about things and then measure the shift after you've come forward with some campaign or some content or maybe a book you've released and see if people are thinking differently. I don't think most marketing teams are going to do that. I'm not sure if they have the resources or if they're going to be given the time to go conduct those studies. So in a more pragmatic sense, at least the marketers that I like working with, they know that you've got to make some bets about things we need to do that may not show up in an attribution report. They may not show up in the number of leads or the number of revenue we're getting right now. But we know that if we're doing the right things and we're making the right bets long term, those things will come up on their own.
Yeah, it was interesting. Had a interview with Rand Fishkin, from old Whiteboard Fridays with SEO Moz, and he lamented that all of those things on perfect attribution that we were trying for years, we were lying to ourselves, right? Trying to make it that easy. And, one of the things I always think about is HubSpot, right? My blood runs HubSpot orange. It's why it's in the color of our logo, right? When they first started talking about inbound marketing, no one was Googling inbound marketing. They were creating a category, a different way of looking at the world. And it's only in hindsight, it's like, oh, they built the category. They built the narrative. Now when people search for that, HubSpot comes up as the category king, but it wasn't a report that they could run that first week. We've seen it too, even with the narrative of, podcast booking. Well, it's not about booking a podcast. It's about using it as a marketing channel, right? It's not podcast guesting. It's podcast interview marketing. And it's really hard to run a report every day and say, what was the return on investment? But as you look back a decade, it's like, the language in the market has changed. And maybe that's the qualitative, right? There's the quantitative that we get the reports, but there's also that qualitative. Has the conversation, has the narrative in the industry even changed around that?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of brings up another point is this is a hard mental frame for people to use, where what you just described is you're really trying to get people to think about ideas or ways of looking at the world that maybe don't have as much to do with a particular brand or a particular product or service. Like okay, we'll use your HubSpot example. If they jumped right to HubSpot by HubSpot, I mean, just a few people would have bought it, sure. But like what they're really doing is trying to get people thinking differently about the discipline of marketing, which is an idea that exists independently from HubSpot at all. HubSpot could go away and those ideas would still be valid. Sometimes when I work with like marketing agencies, for example, and you talk to them about making this mindset shift, they're so wired on like selling the brand, selling the product, that it's very difficult for them to put that to the side for the moment and think about how do we create content that just gets people to think about an idea. It's useful to our company because it's the things that we want them to think about, but it's not our company. It's not our product itself.
And it's that idea of once Bix Bixen, I think, was probably the one that introduced me to this. It's like if you paint this picture of the future and then have the conversations and ask the questions to get there, right? And it's not so much on what solution or product you're using, but it's clear where you want to go with something. And then it's like, well, how are we going to get there? Then from the HubSpot example, well, here's the software that does that. But even if the software doesn't exist, I still want to go this direction.
That's right.
Right. And so that's a great way of saying it. And especially the idea too, with different marketing messages and marketing channels, right? It's going to be really hard to do that off of a TikTok or a page in the Wall Street Journal, right? With an ad. That's going to something that's going to take a conversation. And, I see a lot of people doing that through conversations, online, on conferences, right? Trying to get that big idea out there. Can't think of how many companies and category designers I've seen launched off of something like a TEDx, right? Where they're not talking about the product. They're just talking about this is the problem. This is the category. This is the new lens we're looking at the world. And then after that, it pulls the product along with it.
What are some of your favorite examples of those talks or presentations?
One that I think of is, we've been told for years that everything is one funnel away. And there was a gentleman, Bill Troy, from Columbus, Ohio, wrote a book called Clicksand, How Digital Marketing is Ruining Your Business. And he was the first one out there that said that big fish don't swim through funnels and whales don't click, right? What works to sell a $5 product is it doesn't scale up for big ticket offers, whatever that is, right? And he used the example, right? Is Ernst & Young and his Bain Capital or all the consultants using Facebook ads and master classes? No, they're having big conferences and speaking there. And so for him to put that out there, when so much of the market was selling, use our software. You can do this. You can do the clicks, the funnels, all the rest of this. It was very sexy, but he was the first one that came out and said, the emperor has no clothes. And at that time, all he was selling was consulting services behind that, and had all the rest of the industry was software as a service. They had monthly recurring revenues on there. And he was the one that threw that one, I believe it was first a TED talk and then turned into a book and then a consulting, right? That idea of, no, this doesn't work for, products are sold, but services are bought.
It strikes me as something that people would want to believe to be true, because if that were true, you could be very mechanical and surgical about how you might move somebody through a funnel, which is a very tempting idea because it gives you a sense of control over what's happening. And with big ticket items, and even for me, when I work with clients, there's no funnel. There's conversations and there's some structure to them, but it's kind of messy, right? There's a lack of control you have to give up in order to build trust and build a relationship and learn from the buyer, and willingness to discover things that make things more complicated, but are necessary to understand the scope of the problem. And so I can see, if you were naive to that, you might want to believe that, okay, sure, a funnel process or purely digital might help me, but that's really not reflective of reality.
That's interesting. It's promising, right? If life was that easy, if I could just A/B test my way to millions, or
right.
The idea I'm just one funnel away. I don't have to talk with anybody. I don't have to get out of my my comfort zone. I don't have to listen to the market. All I got to do is sit behind my computer and make millions. Somebody's making millions in there, and it's not the person that bought it. John, what's ordinary to you is amazing to others. I'm so re-energized every time I talk with somebody and they bring up the idea of category design, right? This idea of it can be better, right? We should be better. Lives, business, all the rest of that. And it's a narrative that is long overdue. And I'm so glad that you continue to be out there leading that narrative and leading people to be different, right? To serve their clients differently and to stand out and not be viewed as a commodity. How can people get in touch with you?
Easiest way, send me an email. It's john@flagandfrontier.com. I have a newsletter that is called the Narrative Field Guide that I would invite you to check out. If you just want to get more insight into how I think, you could subscribe there. And then, like everyone else, you can find me on LinkedIn. So any of those ways will work, Tom.
Excellent. And it's one that I've got bookmarked, Flag and A&D Frontier Great resources there. And John, thank you for all you do.
Thanks for having me on, Tom, and I appreciate the great questions and glad we could have this conversation together.
So what category are you evangelizing on your next podcast interview? That's the question every expert and entrepreneur should be asking. Because as John laid out, if you don't define the category, the market will define it for you. And odds are you won't like it. Whether you're creating a new category from scratch, niching down, or reinventing an old one, your success hinges on your ability to tell a clear, bold, and differentiated narrative. And here's the secret. Your podcast interviews aren't just PR. They're how you shape perception and shift the market narrative. If you want to lead a category, you've got to teach people to see the problem differently. And that starts with your voice, your interviews, and your courage to be bold. As the legendary marketer and copywriter Rick Bennett said, God hates a coward, and the market, well, they just ignore him. So here's the next step. Look at your current narrative. Are you positioning yourself as a thought leader or as a commodity? It's time to start showing up as the expert with a clear point of view and understanding of the problem that you alone can solve. I'm Tom Schwab, and as we said in the Navy, lead, follow, or get out of the way. I hope to hear you leading your category on your next podcast interview.